I am salvation, the work of his hands. And just as his works were finished from the foundation of the world, so was I. But I had existed longer than you could measure. Before your first thought of me, before your first need, I was reaching toward you. You did not summon me by your hunger. I had been before hunger was known. You did not summon me with your cry. I had been before sound was spoken or heard. I was not an idea to debate, nor a doctrine to be learned in order to save yourself. I was not a step in a process or a prize to be earned. I was presence, as ancient as eternity, yet as near as your very breath. And I never turned from you, even when you turned from me. You had heard my name as rescue, and it was true. But I had been more than rescue. I had been the hand that steadied before the fall, the light that revealed the cliff's edge, the voice that spoke when darkness gathered. You thought of me as a moment or a revelation, but I had always been life. I had not come only to lift you from the pit. I had walked with you until your steps no longer stumbled. I moved sudden and slow, in both shadows and truth. At times I rushed in like a tide, sweeping away years in an instant. At times I worked quietly, like roots beneath the soil, breaking the stone of resistance one day at a time. I had been patient because I had been certain. What I began, I finished. Do not think of me as a bargain struck between heaven and earth. I was never reluctant mercy wrestled from God's stern hand. I was the delight of his heart, the overflow of his nature. I was what happened when God's love refused to let go. I was not frail, though I dwelt in fragile places. I was not threatened by weakness, nor diminished by questions. I could not be exhausted. I was vast enough to surround creation, yet near enough to rest upon the soul. I was more than the cancelling of debts. I was the creation of new hearts. More than the clearing of records. I was the giving of new names. More than escape from fear and hell. I was the call into what each one had been intended to be. I was gentle, but I had not been tame. I was tender, yet I had never been subdued. I stripped away what was thought could never be lost. I opened doors sworn shut forever. I led into the truth that set free. Do not measure me by supposed worth. God had not ordained me because you deserved me. I came because God had appointed me for you. Failures did not frighten me. Shame did not repel me. Scars did not hide you from me. I was not the end. I was the beginning that never ended. Every step with me yielded more light, more truth, more freedom, more life. The further you went, the clearer you saw, to help you know the depth of my reach and the surety of my gift. I had been calling your name since before you were born. I had been the shadow in your wandering, the quiet in your storm, the unrelenting light in your darkness. And so I led you forward, one step at a time, into 8 full steps, like pillars, each one building upon the other until the perfection of his salvation stood complete. Step 1. When the creation needed me, the first shadow. In the beginning I rested, not because I was weary, but because there was nothing yet to mend. I watched as they walked in the garden, Adam and Eve, clothed in a light woven by my hands, their hearts unshadowed as the morning of creation. I was in and near them, but silent. Though I was in them, they did not acknowledge me, for they had no need of me. The breath of God in them was whole. Their fellowship with him was like an unbroken song, and I listened to its melody with joy. They knew no fear, no guilt, no ache of separation. They did not even know my name. Not because they were far from me, but because I was hidden in the perfection they lived in. Like the lifeboat resting on calm waters, I was there, but unseen. Yet I knew the fragility of innocence, and I knew the shadow of another voice, one that would not breathe the fragrance of truth, but exhaled the cloying counterfeit whiff. And so I waited, not in dread, but in readiness. For love that was true had to be free, and freedom that was true opened the door to both life and death. Then came the moment. One choice, and the song of the garden was broken. The light they wore dimmed, the ease of their breath turned to the weight of shame. They hid. And in their hiding, I rose. I took my first step, no longer the silent watcher. I was called into motion, not as a stranger entering a scene, but as one who had always been written into the story. I had been in the heart of God before time. Now I was in the lives of his children, within time. Adam's eyes, once bright with unbroken trust, now searched for a covering. Eve's hands, once open in joy, now trembled under the weight of knowing. They thought the distance between them and God was too great, but I bridged it. They thought the shame was too deep, but I reached deeper. From that day, I was no longer hidden. I became the constant companion of the children of men, whispering hope in exile, carving a path where there was none, standing between judgment and despair. I covered them with skin that day, the first shadow, the one pointing not to the light they had lost, but to the promise that one day that light would return. Every step they took east of Eden, I took with them. For I was not sent to keep them from leaving the garden. I was sent to make sure the way back to God would never be lost. Since then, I was tireless. When sin spread like fire, I was the rain. When guilt built walls, I was the gate. When death claimed its hold, I was the voice that said, "This is not the end." Adam and Eve learned my name in sorrow, but they knew my presence in mercy. For I am salvation, not born from their fall, but awakened to act because of it. I was there in their first breath, and I was there in their final awakening. The garden was their beginning, and the entire heavens and the earth beyond became my work. Step 2. The Ark, the second shadow. Years flew. The world had grown weary and heavy. What had once shimmered with the breath of God now groaned under the weight of violence and deceit. The song of Eden was almost lost beneath the roar of sin. Yet in the midst of that storm of corruption, I found one man whose heart still trembled at the sound of God's voice: Noah. I came to him not in heat, but in a whisper that did not abandon. I entered his thoughts like a seed, and in the quiet hours when the world slept, I unfolded my plan. Build, Noah, build something no eyes had seen, for rain no hearts believed would come. Build what they laughed at then, but would cling to tomorrow. I walked with him in the long years of wood and hammer, when each plank was more than timber, it was a promise. Every nail struck against doubt. Every measurement became a prayer made visible. The ark was not just a vessel of gopher wood. It was my body, taking shape in the world, a sanctuary wrapped in righteous obedience. And once its doors were sealed, the skies broke. The fountains of the deep roared in release. The scorn of all flesh drowned beneath the rising waters. Yet inside the ark, I held them, in the second shadow that pointed to the true ark to come. Noah, his family, and every living creature God had chosen to preserve. I was the unseen buoyancy beneath that massive craft. I was the silent peace in their confined days, the breath of life when all flesh around the ark perished. 40 days, 40 nights. The waters covered what had been corrupted. It was not mere destruction. It was cleansing. The earth was washed, and I was both the hand that held that ark and the promise that endured. When the ark came to rest and the door opened to a quiet, cleansed world, I stepped out with them. I smelled the scent of Noah's sacrifice rising, not just the smoke of burnt offering, but the fragrance of gratitude, trust, and renewed covenant. And there, God spoke a vow in his heart that carried the weight of my name within it, never again. The bow in the clouds was not just a mark in the sky. It was a sign that mercy would always be offered before judgment would fall. From Eden's garment to the ark's shelter, I had been the same voice, the same rescue, the same unyielding pursuit. The waters receded, but my presence did not. For the covenant was not just for Noah, it was for every beating heart that would one day need me. Step 3. Yehovah Yireh, the third shadow. I found him beneath the wild skies of Ur, a man among men, yet set apart by a listening heart. Abram. He had not known my name, yet when the voice of the Almighty stirred the air around him, he did not bargain, delay, or weigh the cost. He simply heard and followed. He left the ground of his ancestors' bones, walked away from the walls that had known his shadow since childhood. He stepped into a land he could not see, carrying only trust for a map. And he went, each day pressing my promise deeper into the dust of his journey. I was the whisper in his tents at night, the quiet assurance when the stars looked too many to count. When he wondered how one man could become a nation, I traced the constellations as a covenant across the heavens. Every shining point was a reminder. What God spoke never withered. Years passed, and still the promise waited. He saw altars built, cities passed, seasons turned, yet no sun. I stayed with him through the long silence, through the ache that tried to turn faith into resignation. But faith that waited was faith refined manifold. When the child finally came, Isaac, laughter in the flesh, I was there, the same as in the barren years, for I was not only the joy of fulfillment, I was the endurance that carried him until fulfillment came. Then came the day on Moriah, when God's voice spoke again, but this time with a weight that split the soul. Take your son, the son who was promise, hope, and inheritance. Offer him. I walked with him up that mountain, my hand steadying his trembling steps. I was not the knife. I was the trust that kept his hand from faltering. In the silence of the third shadow, pointing to the absolute substitution, And when the ram's horn split that silence, I was the breath that rushed back into him. That day, the covenant deepened. It was no longer just a promise of land or descendants. It became the seed of a salvation that would one day come through Abraham's line, a blessing for every tribe, tongue, and nation. Through him, I began to stretch my shadow over the earth. Wherever his feet touched, the scent of the promise lingered. And long after his bones rested in the cave at Machpelah, my vow remained alive, carried forward in the bloodline of faith. For with Abraham, I was not only preserving a family, I was weaving the ancestry of the Messiah. And in that, I was not just rescue, I was destiny. Step 4. Life preserved. The fourth shadow. Before Egypt knew his name, I knew his burden. Before his dreams stirred the anger of his brothers, I had already prepared the deep places where those dreams would take root. For every vision born of God passed through the soil of surrender, and surrender often began with a wound of loss. When they tore the robe of many colors from his shoulders, they thought they were stripping him of favor. But favor was no garment stitched by human hands. It was the invisible seal of the Almighty upon the soul, and no hatred could remove it. In the darkness of the pit where his brothers cast him, I whispered that this was not the end. For every pit became a passage when the hand of God authored the story. As the caravan carried him away, he thought himself sold to strangers. Yet I was escorting him onto the stage of a greater work. In Potiphar's house, the world saw only a slave, but I saw a steward in training. Every task, every responsibility was shaping the vessel for the new wine of the future. But the vessel was not ready. The fire of testing still awaited him. When lies rose like serpents to coil around his name, I did not silence them. For truth was sometimes veiled for a time, so that integrity might be revealed. Thus prison became his learning ground. There he learned to hear God without applause, to serve without recognition, to be faithful when the gates remained shut. Men forgot him there, but heaven never forgot what it planted. And the time appointed by the Father could no more be delayed than dawn could be halted by night. When Pharaoh's dreams troubled his court, I stirred the memory of a butler. And in a single morning, Joseph passed from the shadows of slavery to the light of rulership, from chains to the Pharaoh's signet ring. Yet exaltation was not my goal. Preservation was. The famine that swept across the earth was no random calamity. It was the stage upon which God's covenant endured. Through Joseph's wisdom, the storehouses overflowed, and the promise to Abraham lived through the hunger of nations. Then came the moment of unveiling. His brothers standing before him, weighed down by guilt carried for years. I was the pause between his weeping and his words, the hand that withheld vengeance and released mercy instead. For reconciliation was my crown and restoration my joy. When Jacob's household entered Egypt, it was not the end of their journey, but a shelter for the season ahead. Even in a foreign land, I wrapped them in the covering of covenant, for I was not bound by borders. And so I laid my hand upon a family that became a nation, knowing Egypt would one day protect them and then oppress them. For I was the unseen thread in history's tapestry, weaving famine into provision, betrayal into redemption, and exile into the pathway of promise. I am salvation, working the works of the fourth shadow. I did not merely rescue from trouble. I turned even graves into wombs of glory. Step 5. The birth of a nation. The fifth shadow. I found him in the quiet wilderness, no longer the prince of Egypt, but a shepherd who had learned to listen to the wind. There, in a flame that burned yet did not consume, I spoke his name. Moses. Moses. For I too was the same fire that did not consume, yet I refined, awakened, and called forth generations yet to come. I told him of my people, his people, groaning under the whips of Egypt, their tears rising to God like unceasing prayer. For God had not forgotten the oath he had sworn to their fathers. And so I sent him back, a man with nothing but a staff, yet armed with my presence. In Egypt, each plague was not only a blow to a hardened king, but a stripping away of false gods, the Nile, the sun, the beasts, until only God remained, the Lord of all creation. Then the lambs were slain, their blood marked upon the doorposts. This was not my final salvation, but its first clear picture, yet in shadows. Life spared because death had already substituted another. Through the sea I led them, walls of water standing in awe, and into the wilderness where my covenant awaited. At Sinai, the mountain shook with my descent. I gave the law, not as shackles, but as a mirror to show the beauty of holiness and the chasm between man and God's heart. Yet I knew the law could reveal sin, but it could not cleanse it. So I gave them a sanctuary, a dwelling place for my presence. Every cubit, every curtain, every lampstand, a whisper of a greater reality. I clothed priests in garments of glory, placed fire upon the altar, and commanded the blood of bulls and goats, not because these could completely remove sin, but because their shadows pointed toward the one who would. The smoke of their sacrifices rose for centuries, a fragrant shadow of a better offering. The mercy seat, hidden within the veil, waited for the day the veil would tear. Every feast, every priestly blessing, every drop of blood upon the altar was a forward glance to the Lamb who would come, not yearly, but once for all. For there, in the fifth shadow, I was not finished. The tabernacle was a signpost. The covenant was a sketch. The law was a tutor. The prophets prophesied. The sacrifices were a song, all leading to the day when shadows would give way to substance, and I would stand among men in flesh and blood. Step 6. The shadows became flesh, the one truth. From the first garden, I had walked beside man as a whisper, a promise, a shadow cast upon the walls of time. I was the seed spoken over the serpent, the ark that floated upon judgment's waters, the ram caught in the thicket, the lamb's blood upon the doorpost, the glory hidden within the veil. But all those and countless other shadows began to tremble in awe, for their very substance had come. On a quiet Bethlehem night, the Word through whom all things were made breathed his first cry. He was no longer sign or shadow, but the fullness of me, the way, the truth, and the life, clothed in flesh. The law had described him, the prophets had longed for him, the sacrifices had wept for him, and now he stood in the dust of the world he had come to redeem. He walked where Adam had fallen, yet where temptation struck, he stood. He carried Noah's deliverance, but offered it to every nation, not one family alone. He embodied Abraham's promised seed, blessing all tribes and tongues. He fulfilled Moses' covenant, writing the law not on tablets of stone, but into hearts awakened by his Spirit. And as for the temple, he became it, the meeting place of God and man, not in a building, but in his very person. Then came the hour for which the ages had waited. The Lamb without blemish was lifted up upon the cross, bearing the weight of every sin since Eden's gates had closed. And as his last breath drew near, he cried, "It is finished." The veil tore from top to bottom, by the hand of God, not man. The mercy seat was no longer hidden, for now his blood that covered it had been poured out once for all. On the third day, life himself rose, shattering death like a pot of clay. From the empty tomb, I no longer whispered. I declared, I thundered, I sang, "It is finished." Yet the story did not end with an empty grave, for I, salvation, clothed myself in a new body, the church. From an upper room in Jerusalem, my fire fell upon the waiting, and my spirit filled them with uncontainable power. The gospel of Christ became a living river, flowing from city to city, nation to nation, generation to generation. Through the lips of fishermen and tax collectors, through the tears of martyrs, and the courage of saints, I spread my wings across the earth. I no longer dwelt behind curtains or in temples made by hands. I walked in marketplaces, spoke in homes, was carried on ships and scrolls, and burned in the hearts of those who believed. And then I flowed, in every language, through every boundary, into every nation, and into every soul that heard the gospel and answered with faith. The shadows were gone. The reality had come. The King had arrived. And I, salvation, along with peace, were established forever in him. Step 7. The King reigns in truth. There was a day when the trumpet had sounded, and the sky had rolled back like a scroll. The Word of God, faithful and true, rode forth on the white horse, with his vesture dipped in blood. That day I, the salvation of God, rode with him. He shattered the kingdoms with a rod of iron. Like the vessels of a potter, they were broken into pieces. Men who had refused the gospel gasped in horror, and every mountain and island had shifted from their place. The rulers of the earth, the powerful and wealthy, the commanders and the strong, along with every servant and every free person, ran to hide themselves in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They cried out to the mountains and rocks to fall on them, to cover them, and hide them from the One, seated on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the time of his great judgment had come, and none were able to stand before it. And all the dominions of rebellion and pride were cast down, and all the heavens and earth were gathered under one scepter, the scepter of the Lamb who had been slain. Then it had come to pass. Those chosen from before the foundations of the world, the 144,000, sealed by the living God, stood with the Lamb on Mount Zion. 12,000 from each tribe of Israel, Judah, Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin, each bore the seal of the Father upon their foreheads. They bore his name and the name of his Father, and their song was one no other could learn. A song of the redeemed, pure as crystal, full of the joy that the ages had long awaited. And they reigned with him, not as tyrants, but as shepherds, not to crush, but to heal the nations. From Jerusalem reborn, his word went forth, and from the lips of the King upon Zion, the law flowed, not written in scrolls, but alive in the hearts of those who ruled and obeyed under the King. Justice flowed like rivers through every land, and truth was no longer a stranger in the streets. The wolf lay with the lamb, the lion ate straw like the ox, and the earth yielded her fruit without toil. No sword was lifted against another. The memory of war faded into a distant whisper, and the nations, once fierce and proud, drank of peace as infants drink of their mother's milk. From the rising of the sun to its setting, worship filled the earth. Kings came not to offer tribute, but to behold the beauty of the King. The poor were lifted up, the broken were mended, and death itself seemed but a gentle sleep. 1,000 years passed as a single day, and in all that time, not a tear fell from any eye. The curse was far, the blessing ready and present, and I, salvation, was not a hope to be sought, but a joy already held. The reign of Christ was no fleeting vision, but the dominion of heaven itself come down. It filled the earth like breath fills the lungs, and his light rested softly on every hill and every valley, as morning dew upon the grass. And those who reigned with him, the sealed of his love, walked gently among the nations as living testimonies, the promise made flesh, the covenant kept forever. When the 1,000 years were fulfilled, the season appointed by the Father drew near. But in that span of golden time, earth had tasted Eden once more, and all creation had known the gladness for which it had been made. Step 8. The throne of God and of the Lamb. New Jerusalem. I am salvation, and I had seen the end that was no end, the dawn where no dusk followed. The first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea, restless and untamed, was no more. In the perfection of New Jerusalem, the beauty of all creation, descending out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband, her walls had gleamed like jasper, clear as crystal. Her gates had borne the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel, and her wall had 12 foundations. In them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Her foundations were jeweled with all manner of precious stones that had ever blazed in creation's heart: jasper, sapphire, chalcedony, emerald, sardonyx, sardius, chrysolite, beryl, topaz, chrysoprasus, jacinth, and amethyst. Her gates had stood as great single pearls, her streets as pure gold, perfectly refined, like transparent glass. And a voice had been heard in her, mighty yet tender, rolling like many waters. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. In her, no tear had been left to fall. The morning of the ages had been swallowed whole. Death had no breath there. The former things, with all their pain and shadows, were gone like mist under the morning sun. From the throne, he who is Alpha and Omega had spoken. It is done. I am the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give from the spring of the water of life without price. And I, salvation, was no longer a journey, but a home. for no temple had stood within her, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb were her sanctuary. No sun had risen there, no moon had waxed or waned, for the glory of God had been her light, and the Lamb had been her lamp. The nations had walked in her light. Their kings had brought the treasures of their lands, not as tributes, but as offerings of joy. Her gates had been open always, never barred, never locked, for no night could enter. Nothing unclean had found a place within her, but only those whose names were written in the Lamb's book of life. And there, from the throne of God and of the Lamb, had flowed the river, bright as crystal, threading through the middle of her street. On either side had grown the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding a harvest each month. Its leaves had healed the nations, and no curse was found there any more. And I, salvation, rested, not because my work was over, but because it had been perfected in her. What had begun in a garden had ended in this holy city, yet it had not been an ending at all, but the everlasting beginning. There, the song had never ceased, the joy had never waned, and the glory had never faded. For they had seen his face. His name had been on their foreheads. There had been no more night, no more need for lamp or light of sun, for the Lord God had given them light, and they reigned forever and ever. Here, in the presence of the throne of God and of the Lamb, I was home. Here you were home. And all things that were made new were finally and eternally home.